Morning everyone. So Skulduggery Pleasant, chapter 10. I had to just look where I was up to. Chapter 10, halfway through. Chapter 10. Skulduggery had another surprise for her as they drove. He pulled into the fast food place and nodded to the parcel in the back seat. "What's that?" she asked. "What do you think?" "It looks like a parcel." "Well, then that's what it is." "But what's inside it?" "If I tell you, I deprive the parcel of its whole reason for being," she sighed. "And what is that reason for being?" "To be opened, of course, and to reveal what it's holding." "You are so annoying," Stephanie muttered, reaching back and taking the parcel. It was soft to touch. She looked at Skulduggery. "The clothes?" "I'm saying that." "Ghastly made the clothes already. I didn't think he was going to make them at all, not after, the argument." Skulduggery shrugged and started humming. Stephanie sighed and took a parcel. She got out of the yellow car and walked into the fast food restaurant, making her way to the toilets at the back. Once secured inside a cubicle, she pulled open the string and the parcel unfolded before her. It was the clothes. They were the deepest black, made of a material she had never seen before. She got changed quickly, noting how perfectly everything fitted, stepped out of the cubicle to admire herself in the mirror. The trousers, the tunic, a sleeveless garment with silver clasps were pretty good by themselves, and the boots fitted as though she'd been wearing them for years. But it was the coat that completed the picture, 3/4 length, shaped especially for her, made of a material so black it nearly shimmered. She resisted the temptation to leave her other clothes in the toilet, and instead wrapped them in the brown paper and left the restaurant. "Surprise!" Skulduggery said when she was back in the canary car. "It's the clothes." She looked at him. "You're so weird." 20 minutes later, they were walking into the Waxworks Museum. The building was old, in dire need of repair, and the street wasn't much better. Stephanie didn't say a word as they paid and went wandering through the dark corridors, surrounded on both sides by imitation celebrities and fictional characters. She had been here 2 or 3 times as part of school trips when she was younger, but couldn't see the point of visiting now. They hung back from a small group of tourists until they were certain they were alone, and only then did Stephanie say anything. "What are we doing here?" "We're here to visit the elders," Skulduggery replied. "Are the elders made of wax?" "I like coming here," he said, taking off his sunglasses and ignoring her question. "It's very liberating." He took off his hat and wig and pulled the scarf from his neck. Stephanie looked around nervously. "Aren't you afraid someone might see?" "Not in the slightest." "Well, maybe we should go and talk to the elders then." "Good idea." Skulduggery, moved to one side of the corridor and traced his hand over the wall. "Where is it?" he muttered. "Bloody idiots keep changing it." The tourists came back around the corner, and Stephanie went to drag Skulduggery out of sight, but it was too late. They had already seen him. A small American boy left his parents' side and walked right up to him. Skulduggery was frozen to the spot. "Who's he meant to be?" "Oh, I'm supposed to be American." "Can't do American," the boy asked, frowning slightly. Stephanie hesitated. Now the entire tour was looking at her, including the tour guide. "This is," Stephanie explained, racking her brains for a likely sounding explanation. "This is Sammy Skeleton, the world's worst detective." "Can't do American." "Never heard of him," the boy said, giving Skulduggery's arm a poke. He shrugged and lost interest, and Stephanie watched the tourists carry on. When they were out of sight, Skulduggery swiveled his head on to her. "World's worst detective?" he asked. She shrugged and hid her grin, and Skulduggery harumphed good-naturedly and went back to running his hand along the wall. He found what he was looking for and pressed inwards. A section of the wall slid open to reveal a hidden passage. "Whoa!" Stephanie said. "Sanctuary is in here? I used to come here when I was little." "Never knowing what's beneath your feet was a world of magic and wonder now, did you?" "Exactly." He tilted his head slightly. "Better get used to that feeling." She followed him in, and the wall sealed shut behind them. The stairway downwards was lit by torches that flickered in their brackets, but closer they got to wherever it was they were going, the brighter they became. They emerged into a gleaming foyer of the sanctuary. It would have reminded Stephanie of the lobby to a high-tech company building, all marble and varnished wood panelling, were it not for the lack of windows. 2 men stood guard against the far wall, hands clasped behind them, dressed entirely in grey, with long coats and some sort of helmet with a visor that covered their entire faces. Each had a scythe, a wicked-looking blade, on a 1.5-metre staff, strapped to their backs. A slight man in a suit came out to greet them. "Detective," he said. You, early. The council not ready to convene. I could show you to the waiting area if you wish. Actually, I might like to take the opportunity to show our guest around, if that's all right with you. The man blinked. Nope, afraid not. Access limited. You know this. I was just going to show my friend the repository, Skulduggery said. The book, in fact. I see. Well, as administrator of the sanctuary, I would have to accompany you, naturally, of course. I wouldn't have it any other way. The administrator bowed and spun on his heel and led them down an adjoining corridor. They passed more people in grey uniforms as they walked. Stephanie was getting used to dealing with people with no eyes, no expressions, but there was something about them that unnerved her. Skulduggery, living skeleton though he was still fundamentally human, and yet these people, who merely wore helmets to hide their faces, seemed to her much more sinister. Who were they? Stephanie whispered as they walked. Cleavers, Skulduggery replied in a low voice. Security guards, enforcers and army rolled into one. Dangerous individuals. Be glad they're on outside. She'd have best not to look at them as they passed. Where we're going, she said, trying to change the subject. I'm taking you to see Book of Names, Skulduggery said. Some say it were created by the ancients, but truth is no one really know how it were made or who it were made by. It lists the name of every person living on the earth, the given name, the taken name, when and if a name were taken, and the true name. Every time a baby born, a new name appears in its pages. Every time someone dies, their name fades away. Stephanie looked at him. So my true name is in the book? Aye, is mine, as is everyone's. Isn't that dangerous? Someone got their hands on that, they'd be able to rule the world. She let a few moments pass, and I felt ridiculous even saying that. The administrator glanced over his shoulder as he walked. Not even elders open book. It's too powerful. It can corrupt too easily, but they can't find a way to destroy it. It can't be torn, burnt, can't be damaged by any means we have at our disposal. If the legends are true, and the book were created by the ancients, then it stands to reason that only the ancients could destroy it. Elders, for their part, see it as their responsibility to protect it, keep it away from prying eyes. They reached a set of double doors. The administrator waved his hands, and the heavy door swung open. They walked into the repository, a large room with marble pillars, which, as Skulduggery explained, housed some of the rarest and most unusual magical artefacts in existence. They passed row upon row of shelves and tables on which lay items so bizarre they defied description. The administrator pointed out one of the strangest of these, a two-dimensional box that held wonders to sate the most jaded of appetites, but which only existed if approached from a right angle. From a right angle, even. In contrast to this clutter, however, was the centre of the room, which was empty save for a pedestal, and on that pedestal, a book. Is that the Book of Names? Stephanie asked. Yes. The administrator answered. I thought it'd be bigger. It's as big as it needs to be, no more or less. And it's okay to leave it out in the open like that? It's not as vulnerable as you might think. When it was placed here, the security arrangements did cause the elders some concern. How would it be protected? Guards can be overcome, a locked door can be unlocked, a wall can be broken, a shield can be pierced. So what? They just decided not to bother? Actually, they came up with the most ingenious defence. Willpower. Sorry? The book is protected by the will of the elders. Stephanie wasn't sure if he was joking or not. See for yourself, the administrator said. Take the book. Me? You won't be harmed. Stephanie glanced over at Skulduggery, but he gave no indication as to what she should do. Finally, she turned and started walking towards it. Her eyes darted from one side of the room to the next. She thought about trapdoors and immediately started examining the floor she walked on. What form did willpower take? She hoped it wasn't bullets or anything painful like that. She was mildly annoyed that she was even doing this, walking right into whatever trap the elders had set up, and doing so willingly. For what? To prove a point that she wasn't even hers? She didn't even want to take the book. This whole thing was ridiculous. She glanced back, saw the administrator standing there with a placid expression on his face, obviously anticipating whatever was about to happen, whatever was going to pop out in front of her to stop her from taking this precious so-called book. She stopped walking. If he wanted the book, he could get it himself. She turned and walked right back again. The administrator peered at her. You didn't take it then, he said. Stephanie forced herself to remain polite. No, I didn't. But I'll take your word for it that it's well protected. When you started walking, you wanted to take the book, yes? I suppose so. And why didn't you? Well, because I changed my mind. Because you didn't want to take it anymore? Well, yes. And? That is the will of the elders. No matter how badly you want that book in your hands, the closer you get, the less you want to. It doesn't matter if you want it for yourself, if you want it because you were ordered to take it, or because your very life depends on it. With every step you take, your indifference towards the book increases. No matter who you may be with or what power you may have, even Meritorious himself couldn't get close to it. Stephanie looked at him, taking it all in. Finally, she had to say, there was no way she couldn't. That is ingenious and very impressive. Well done, sir. It is, isn't it? The administrator turned his head a little, as if hearing something. Counsel, ready for you. Off you go. Come this way. They walked into an oval-shaped room and stood facing a large door. There was only one light source from somewhere overhead, and the edges of the room remained in relative darkness. The elders will be but a moment, the administrator said, and walked quietly away. They always do this, Skulduggery said. Keep people waiting. My headmaster does the same thing whenever someone's called to his office. He thinks it makes him look important. Do it work? Makes him look late. The door ahead opened and an old man entered. He had short white hair and a tightly cropped beard, and he was tall, much taller than Skulduggery. He wore a suit the colour of granite, and as he walked, Stephanie became aware of the shadows to his right. They seemed to shift and stretch alongside him, and she watched as more of them reached over from the corners of the room to join the mass. The shadows suddenly rose up from the floor and melted into an elderly woman in black. She fell into step behind the tall man, and their footsteps slowed as they neared. A third person faded up from nothing, materialised right out of thin air on the other side of the tall man. He looked a little younger than the others, and he wore a sky-blue suit, the jacket of which was struggling to contain his hefty paunch. Stephanie looked at the elder mages, and the elder mages looked up at Stephanie. Skulduggery, the tall man said eventually. Trouble follows in your wake, doesn't it? I wouldn't say follows, no. It more kinds of sits around and waits for me to get there. The man shook his head. This is your new partner, then? Indeed it is, Skulduggery answered. No taken name? No. Well, that's something at least. Oh, wrong voice. That's something at least. The man shifted his focus to Stephanie. I am Eacon Meritorious, Grand Mage of this council. Beside me are Morwenna Crow and Sagacious Tome. Good names. Can I assume, because you have not yet picked a name, that you do not intend to involve yourself in our affairs for very much longer? Stephanie's throat was dry. I'm not sure. See, Skulduggery said, insubordinate. You have been placed in a dangerous situation, Meritorious continued. Surely you would prefer to go back to the safety of your normal life. What's so safe about it? Ah, Skulduggery chimed in, rebellious too. I mean, Stephanie continued, I could get knocked down crossing the road tomorrow. I could get mugged tonight. I could get sick next week. It's not safe anywhere. Meritorious raised an eyebrow. While this is true, in your normal life you never had to deal with sorcerers and murderer attempts. The elders were gazing at her with interest. Maybe, she admitted, but I don't think I can just forget about all of this. Skulduggery shook his head sadly. Troublesome. The woman, Morwenna Crow, took over. Detective, you have petitioned the council on numerous occasions concerning a supposed threat to the truce. I have. And yet, as you have failed to provide evidence, this girl standing beside me is me evidence, Skulduggery said. Twice she has been attacked, and twice her attacker has been after a key. What key? Sagacious Tome asked. Skulduggery hesitated. Mr. Pleasant, I believe the attacker's master to be Serpine. What key, detective? If Serpine is ordering attacks on civilians, there is a clear breach of the truce, and the council has no choice but to... The key, Mr. Pleasant. What does it open? Stephanie glanced at Skulduggery's inscrutable visage and thought she could detect hints of frustration in the small movements he was making. I believe the key will lead Serpine to the recovery of the sceptre of the ancients. I never know when you're joking, Skulduggery, Meritorious said, starting to smile. I hear that a lot. You are aware that the sceptre is a fable. I am aware that it is thought to be, yes, but I am also aware that Serpine has been working on tracking it down, and I believe Gordon Edgley may have had it. Nefarian Serpine is now an ally, said Sagacious Tome. We live in a time of peace. We live in a time of fear, said Skulduggery, where we're too scared of upsetting the status quo to ask the questions we need to be asking. Skulduggery, Meritorious said. We all know what Serpine did. We all know the atrocities he has committed in the name of his master, Malevolent, and for his own gains, but for as long as the truth holds, we cannot act against him without good cause. He has ordered the attacks on my companions. You have no proof. He murdered Gordon Edgley. Turn me page, 2 seconds. You have no proof. He's after the sceptre, which doesn't even exist. Meritorious shook his head sadly. I'm sorry, Skulduggery. There is nothing we can do. As for the girl, Morwenna said, we had hoped her involvement in all of this would be minimal. She ain't going to tell no one, Skulduggery said. Maybe so, but if she takes one more step deeper into our world, it may be impossible for her to step out again. We want you to consider this carefully, detective. Consider what it would mean. Skulduggery gave a slight nod of acknowledgement, but said nothing. Thank you for agreeing to meet us, Meritorious said. You may leave. Skulduggery turned and walked out, Stephanie right behind him. The administrator hurried over. I know the way out, Skulduggery growled, and the administrator backed off. They passed the cleavers, standing as still as the wax models above them, and climbed the staircase out of the sanctuary. Skulduggery donned his disguise, and they walked back to the canary car in silence. They had almost reached it when he stopped and turned his head. What's wrong? Stephanie asked. He didn't answer. She couldn't see anything beneath his disguise. Stephanie looked around, paranoid. It appeared to be a normal street populated by normal people doing normal things. Granted, the street had potholes and the people were scruffy, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. And then she saw him. A tall man, broad and bald, his age impossible to gauge. He walked towards them like he had all the time in the world, and Stephanie stood by Skulduggery and waited. Mr. Pleasant, the man said when he had reached them. Mr. Bliss, Skulduggery responded. Stephanie looked at this man. He radiated power. His pale blue eyes settled on them. And you must be the girl who attracts all sorts of attention. Stephanie couldn't speak. She didn't know what she would have said, but she did know that her voice would have been thin and reedy if she tried. There was something about Mr. Bliss that made her want to curl up and cry. I ain't seen you in a while, Skulduggery said. I heard you'd retired. There was something peaceful about Mr. Bliss's eyes, but it wasn't the calming kind of peaceful. It wasn't a peaceful that comforted you and made you feel safe. It was another kind of peaceful, the kind that promised you no more pain, no more joy, no more anything. Looking at him was like looking into a void with no beginning, no ending, oblivion. The elders asked me to return, Mr. Bliss said. These are troubling times, after all. That's so. The two men who had Serpine under surveillance were found dead a few days ago. He's up to something he doesn't want the elders to know. Skulduggery paused. Why didn't Meritorious tell me about this just now? The truce is a house of cards, Mr. Pleasant. If it is disturbed, it will all come down, and you are known for your disturbances. The elders hoped my involvement would be enough of a deterrent, but I fear they have underestimated Serpine's ambition. They refuse to believe anyone would benefit from war, and of course they still think the sceptre of the ancients is a fairy tale. Skulduggery's voice changed, but only slightly. You think the sceptre's real. Oh, I know it is. Whether it can do everything the legends claim, that I do not know. But as an object, the sceptre is quite real. It was uncovered during a recent archaeological dig. As I understand it, Gordon Edgley has been searching for the sceptre for some time as part of his research for a book about the Faceless Ones, and he paid a substantial amount of money to gain possession of it. I imagine he worked to verify its authenticity, and once he had done so, he realised he couldn't keep it, nor could he pass it on. Gordon Edgley, for all his faults, was a good man, and if there was a chance that he did have the destructive capabilities we've all heard about, he would have felt that the sceptre was too powerful for anyone to possess. Do you know what he did with it? Stephanie asked, finding her voice at last. I do not. But do you think Sir Pine's willing to risk war for it? Skulduggery asked. Mr. Bliss nodded. I think he views the truce as having outlived its usefulness, yes. I imagine he has been waiting for this moment for quite some time, when he can seize all of the power and plunder every secret and invite the Faceless Ones back into the world. You believe in the Faceless Ones? Stephanie asked. I do. I grew up with those teachings, and I have carried my faith through to this day. Sorry. Some dismiss them, some view them as morality tales, some view them as stories to tell children at night. But I believe that once we were ruled by being so evil, even their own shadows shied away from them. And I believe that they have been waiting to come back to punish us for our transgressions. Skulduggery cocked his head. The elders would listen to you, they'll not listen to me. They are bound by their rules. I have learned what I can, and I have passed it on to the only person who would know what to do with it. What you do next is up to you. With you on our side, things would be a lot easier, Skulduggery said. A small smile appeared on Mr. Bliss's face. If I have to act, I will. Without even a good day, Mr. Bliss turned and walked away. They stayed where they were for a few moments, then got into the canary car, and Skulduggery pulled away from the curb. They drove for a bit before Stephanie said, He's kind of scary. That happens when you rarely smile. Mr. Bliss is physically the most powerful individual on the face of the planet. His strength is beyond legendary. So he is scary? Ah, yeah, very much so. He drove on and settled into silence. Stephanie left a few moments drift by. What are you thinking? Skulduggery gave a small shrug. Lots of clever things. So do you believe that the sceptre is real? It certainly looks that way now, doesn't it? I suppose this is a really big deal for you, huh? Finding out that your gods really existed. Ah, but we don't know that. If the sceptre ain't real, its true history could have been mixed up with legends. Its face existence does not prove that it was used to drive away the Faceless Ones. Funny, I wouldn't have thought that a living skeleton would be such a skeptic. So what's our next move? Skulduggery was silent for a bit. Right, well, we've got to work out what we need. We've got to work out how we get it and what we need to get what we need. Well, that's a bit of a tongue twister. I think I actually understood that, Stephanie said slowly. The car went over a bump. No, gone again. We need the elders to take action, so we need proof that Serpine has broken truce. We need to find the sceptre, and we also need to find out how to destroy it. Okay, so how do we do the first one? Excuse me. Shh. Shush. We'll get the proof once we find the sceptre. And how do we find the sceptre? We'll find the key. And how do we destroy the sceptre? Ah, that'll be a little bit of crime that we're about to have to embark on first. Crime, Stephanie said with a smile. Finally. And I'm going to leave it there. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye. Actually, I'm going to carry on and read chapter 11 because it's not that long. Chapter 11, The Little Bit of Crime. From their vantage point, parked across the road, they watched the vampires once again in their blue overalls walk up the steps and enter the gleaming art gallery. They were chatting and didn't look intimidating at all. A few minutes later, the staff and day shift security started to trickle out of the building. When every one of them was accounted for, Skulduggery reached into the back seat and pulled the black bag into his lap. We're going now? Stephanie asked, looking up into the evening sky. But it's still bright. And that's precisely why we're going now. 20 minutes from now, there'll be 2 fully fledged vampires prowling around in there. I want to get in, find out what to destroy the sceptre, get out before that happens. Ah, yeah, probably wise. Very probably. They got out of the horrible canary car and crossed the street, left the pavement and moved through the garden area to a tall tree behind the gallery. Making sure they wouldn't be seen, Skulduggery put the bag over his shoulder, started to climb. Stephanie jumped from the lowest branch, grabbed it and started climbing up after him. She hadn't done anything like this in years, but climbing a tree was like, well, falling out of one. Easy. The tree's limbs were long and strong, and they quickly came adjacent to the gallery's roof, which was ridged with a dozen skylights. Stephanie hoisted herself up on a branch and sat there, regarding the large gap between building and tree with curiosity. It looked far too far to jump. You sure I can't come with you? I need you out here in case something goes terribly, terribly wrong. Like what? Oh, any number of things. Fills me with confidence, that does. Skulduggery manoeuvred himself onto the longest branch and then walked along it, bent-legged and stooped over. His balance unnatural. But there was still that gap. Without pausing, he sprang forward off the branch. He brought his arms up by his side and out in front, and a tremendous gust of winds buffeted him over to the rooftop. Stephanie promised herself that one day she'd get him to teach her how to do that. Skulduggery looked back. The gallery is outfitted with the most elaborate security systems, but because at Vampires, the alarms on the outer corridors are never set. So once I get by the main hall, it should be plain sailing, as they say. Who says? I don't know. People who sail, presumably. He opened the bag and took out a harness that he started to strap himself to. He looked up at her. Where was I? I have no idea. Ah, yes, me cunning plan. I need to access a control panel on the east wall. From there, I can disable everything. The floor is pressure sensitive, so I'm going to have to stay off it, but that shouldn't be a problem for someone of my natural grace and ability. Very impressed with yourself, aren't you? Exceedingly so. He secured a thin wire onto a ventilation duct, looped it through his harness and led it back to one of the skylights. Stephanie frowned. You're going to have to lower yourself down from here? Yeah, that's the fun bit. Right, but you're going to have to open the skylight. Won't that set off the alarm? Only a small one. And wouldn't that be enough? It's a silent little thing hooked up to the nearby police station, or it were hooked up. I passed by their transformer box before I collected you this morning. Oddly enough, it happened to short out at exactly the same time, something to do with a large amount of water mysteriously manifesting inside. I think they're baffled. They certainly look baffled. And your entire plan hinges on the hope that they haven't restored electricity yet? Well, yeah, he said after a slight hesitation. But anyway, he looked over at the setting sun. If you hear any screaming, that'll be me. He passed his hand over the lock and broke apart, then opened up one of the halves of the skylight and climbed over the side. She watched him disappear, and then heard a slight whirring as he used the handheld control to lower himself down in the harness. Stephanie sat back against the tree trunk, keeping an eye out for whatever she was supposed to be keeping her eye out for. Anything unusual? She frowned to herself, not entirely certain of what constituted unusual anymore. And then she heard an unsettling scraping noise. She looked up. The wire Skulduggery had attached to the ventilation duct was slipping. She watched in horror as it slipped again, getting closer to the edge, closer to slipping off entirely. She thought of the pressure-sensitive floor, thought about Skulduggery crashing down and setting off every alarm in the place, and the vampires running in and catching him. Although he didn't have any blood for them to drink, she was sure they'd be able to find some other way to punish the trespass. The wire slipped again, and Stephanie knew she didn't have a choice. She crawled along the same branch Skulduggery had jumped from, and it groaned beneath her weight. Skulduggery was nothing but bones, she reminded herself, in an effort not to feel fat. The gap was gaping. A gaping, gaping gap. Stephanie shook her head. She couldn't make it. There was no way she could jump. With a decent run at it, she might have had a chance, but from crouching on the end of an unsteady branch. She closed her eyes, forcing the doubts from her mind. It wasn't a choice. She reminded herself. It wasn't a question of whether she could jump or would jump. Skulduggery needed her help, and he needed it now. So a question of when she did jump, what would happen then? She jumped. She stretched out, and the ground moved far beneath her, and the edge of the building rushed at her at an alarming rate, and then she started to dip. Her right hand thudded against the edge, and her fingers gripped. The rest of her body slammed into the side of the building, and she almost fell. But she shot her left arm and hand up to join her right, and held on. She pulled herself up, little by little, until she could get an arm over the edge, and soon she was safe. She had made it. The wire, though, slipped again. It was about to snap from the duct, and then it'd be all over. Stephanie ran to it, got her fingers around the wire and tried to tug it down again, but it was no use. She stood, put the sole of her boot against the wire, and used all of her weight to try and push it down, but she didn't make the slightest bit of difference. She looked around for something to use, saw the bag, and snatched it up. Nothing inside but more wire. She grabbed the wire and dropped to her knees, tying a new piece to the wire already attached to the harness her father had taught her all about knots when she was little. And although she couldn't remember the names of most of them, she knew which knot suited this occasion. With the new length of wire added, she looked around for something to secure it to. There was another skylight right in front of her. She ran to it, wrapping the wire around the entire concrete base, and getting it tied off just as the first piece of wire shot off the duct. There was a sudden snap as the wire went taut again, but it stayed secure. Stephanie hurried over to the edge of the open skylight and looked down. Skulduggery was hovering right above the floor, trying to stay horizontal after the horrible drop. The motion control for the harness was still in his hand, but both arms were outstretched for maximum balance, and he couldn't move himself back up. I'm going to have to stop there because my battery on my phone's about to go flat. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.